Welcome back to the Casual Ethnographer. My name is Elizabeth. I am your internet culture lady, and this is another long-form video, another Casual Ethnographer talk. Today's topic is heavier. We're going to talk about concentration camps and how they go by many names, but understanding them in the context of mass detention. If you're new to my channel, the method that I use is I pick a topic, I do some research, and I kind of take you through my thought process as I'm looking things up. So you might hear me say something like, and my next question was, that's just me keeping you along for the ride. So let's get started. When people hear the phrase concentration camp, they tend to think of one place, one era, and one regime. But concentration camps are not a Nazi invention, and they're not confined to the past. They're a global phenomenon that has appeared under democracies, empires, colonial governments, and authoritarian states. They emerge when a society decides that a particular group of people is a threat, a burden, or a problem to be managed, and when the state claims the right to confine them outside the normal legal process. Right now, there are reports circulating about the conditions inside facilities used by ICE and CBP. And whenever we see mass detention, overcrowding, deprivation, and the suspension of due process, it's important to understand the historical patterns we're stepping into. Concentration camps have a history, a logic, and a set of warning signs. And once you know that history, it becomes much easier to recognize when a society is repeating it. So today I want to walk through where concentration camps come from, how they've been used around the world, and what anthropology, psychology, and sociology can tell us about why societies build them, and what they do to the people inside and outside their walls. So let's start with a global historical overview. Early uses of concentration camps, so this would be pre-Nazi. The first places formally defined as concentration camps were Cuba, 1896, created by the Spanish during the Cuban War of Independence. Conditions were catastrophic. About 10,000 civilians died, mostly from starvation and disease. South Africa, 1900, created by the British during the Anglo-Boer War. Over 45,000 people died, including about 25,000 Boers and about 20,000 Black Africans. Purpose: to confine civilians suspected of aiding army forces, not designed as extermination camps, but conditions were lethal. Colonial and imperial uses. Camps were used by Germany in the Herero and Nama War. I'm probably saying those wrong, so I'll put them on the screen. 1904 to 1907. In German Southwest Africa, death rates reached about 45%. Concentration camps emerged as empire building, counterinsurgency, and racial control across Britain, Spain, the U.S., and Germany around 1900. World War I and the interwar period. Camps expanded dramatically during World War I as states detained civilians and POWs on an unprecedented scale. After the war, authoritarian regimes adapted these techniques for political repression. The Soviet Gulag. The Gulag system, so 1918 to the 1990s, evolved from repression to forced labor and empire building. Millions passed through these camps, and they became central to Soviet economic and political control. Nazi concentration camps. Nazi camps, 1933 to 1945, were used for political repression, forced labor, torture, and mass murder. They represent the most extreme evolution of the concentration camp system. Democratic governments have used them too. The U.S. interned over 100,000 Japanese Americans during World War II. These were not extermination camps, but they were still mass detention without due process. Key pattern. Concentration camps appear across democracies, empires, authoritarian regimes, and colonial governments. They are a modern tool of state power, not an anomaly. Anthropological foundations. Why societies build camps. To isolate groups seen as dangerous, disloyal, racially inferior, politically suspect, or economically burdensome. Camps reflect boundary making, defining who belongs and who does not. So camps is a tool of social engineering, used to reshape populations, so forced labor, cultural assimilation, breaking resistance, and reorganizing society around racial or political hierarchies. Camps as performative violence. Anthropologists note that camps send a message. We can do this to you. They create fear, compliance, and social fragmentation. Camps as states of exception. Normal laws are suspended. People are held without trial. The state exercises power without accountability. Psychological foundations. Dehumanization. Camps rely on stripping people of identity, autonomy, and dignity. This makes harsh treatment psychologically easier for guards and administrators. Obedience and bureaucracy. Camps often function through ordinary people following orders. Bureaucratic distance, diffusion of responsibility. Hannah Arendt's banality of evil applies here. Trauma and long-term harm. Survivors experience PTSD, chronic anxiety, disrupted identity, and intergenerational trauma. Communities experience collective wounds that last decades. Sociological foundations. Camps as indicators of democratic backsliding. When a state begins mass detention, suspending due process, and targeting specific groups, it signals a shift toward authoritarian practices. Camps as pressure valves. Governments use camps to manage political crises, redirect public anger, create scapegoats, and demonstrate control. Camps as normalized institutions. Once built, camps tend to expand, become permanent, and be repurposed for new groups. They rarely disappear without political pressure. So let's take a moment to define what a concentration camp is. So the core definition, a concentration camp is a place where a government forcibly confines a large group of people without the normal protections of law. The key idea is concentration, taking a targeted population, removing them from society, and placing them in a controlled, restricted space. What it does not require torture. It does not require forced labor. It does not require mass death, and it does not require a totalitarian regime. What it does require: mass detention, targeting a specific group, suspension of due process, and state control over movement, resources, and survival. Why the term is so broad? Historically, concentration camp has been used for civilians, political prisoners, ethnic groups, religious minorities, and wartime populations. The defining feature is mass confinement outside normal legal structures. Now let's look at concentration camps versus extermination camps. The relationship. All extermination camps are concentration camps, but not all concentration camps are extermination camps. So concentration camps, their purpose: detention, control, isolation, forced labor, punishment, intimidation. Deaths may occur due to neglect, starvation, disease, violence, but death is not the primary design. Extermination camps, purpose: mass killing as a central function, designed for rapid murder, disposal of bodies, industrialized killing processes. These were a specific subset of Nazi camps. Treblinka, I know, was one of them. I wrote down two others that I'm not sure the pronunciation, but I'm going to try: Sobibor and Belzec. So why the distinction matters. Concentration camp describes a system of confinement. An extermination camp describes a system of killing. Using the correct term helps maintain historical accuracy while still recognizing patterns of harm. Let's talk about scapegoating now. What scapegoating is: blaming a vulnerable group for social problems, economic instability, political failures, and moral panics. Why societies do it. It creates a simple explanation for complex problems. It gives people a target for fear, anger, and uncertainty. It allows leaders to redirect blame away from themselves. Why it works. Humans were wired to seek patterns, reduce uncertainty, and identify causes. Scapegoating provides a false sense of control. How it connects to the camps. Once a group is framed as dangerous, diseased, criminal, or disloyal, the public becomes more willing to accept their confinement. Let's talk about othering now. What othering is: the process of defining a group as fundamentally different, inferior, outside the moral community. How it works: language shifts. Them versus us. Illegals, vermin, invaders, criminals. Visual cues, uniforms, cages, numbers instead of names. Why it's powerful. Othering reduces empathy. It makes harsh treatment feel justified. It allows ordinary people to participate in or ignore cruelty. Othering plus bureaucracy. When othering is combined with paperwork, procedures, or just doing my job, it becomes easier for institutions to commit large-scale harm. Are concentration camps found in ancient humans or hunter-gatherers? And the short answer is no. Concentration camps are a product of complex state-level societies, not ancient humans or hunter-gatherers. Why ancient humans didn't have them? Hunter-gatherer groups were small, mobile, lacked prisons, lacked the population size to concentrate anyone, and lacked the bureaucratic capacity to manage mass detention. What they did have: social sanctions, so shunning, temporary exclusion, conflict resolution rituals, but not mass confinement. Why camps require complex societies? You need large populations, centralized authority, surplus resources, infrastructure, bureaucratic systems, and military or police forces. These conditions only appear with agriculture, cities, empires, and nation states. So the anthropological takeaway: concentration camps are a modern tool of state power, not an ancient human behavior. They emerge when societies become large enough to categorize people, police borders, enforce mass detention, and create states of exception. So at the beginning of this talk, I mentioned some examples of concentration camps, and my question was, as I was digging, are those the earliest in the historical record? And the short answer is yes. The examples are the earliest known concentration camps in historical record. Concentration camps are a modern invention emerging in the late 19th century. Why nothing earlier qualifies? Ancient and medieval societies absolutely committed atrocities, massacres, enslavement, deportation, forced labor, but they did not build concentration camps. Camps require large populations, centralized bureaucracies, the ability to feed, guard, and confine thousands, modern policing and surveillance, rail or road transport, administrative record keeping. These conditions simply didn't exist before the modern state. The earliest documented concentration camps, so Cuba in 1896, Spanish reconcentration policy, again I don't speak Spanish, South Africa 1900, British camps during the Anglo-Boer War, German Southwest Africa 1904 to 1907, camps during the Herero-Nama genocide. These are the first historically recognized concentration camps. Why they appear when they do? Late 1800s equal the rise of industrialized warfare, modern nationalism, racial pseudoscience, mass bureaucracy, and empire-wide policing. Concentration camps are a product of modernity, not antiquity. So now let's shift to the U.S. context, a historical pattern of mass detention. The U.S. has used concentration camp-like systems multiple times. Not extermination camps, but mass detention without due process has appeared repeatedly. So let's look first at indigenous removal and reservation systems. During the 19th century, the U.S. forcibly relocated native nations to reservations. These were involuntary, heavily policed, restricted in movement, and dependent on government rations. While not called camps, they functioned as systems of confinement and control. 2. The Indian boarding school system. Children were forcibly taken from families, confined in institutions designed to erase culture and identity, movement restricted, punishment severe. Again, not labeled camps, but structurally similar to coercive confinement systems. Next, the Civil War POW camps. Both Union and Confederate forces operated camps with catastrophic conditions. Andersonville is the most infamous example. These were wartime camps not targeted at civilians, but they show early U.S. use of mass confinement. The Philippines, 1899 to 1902. During the Philippine-American War, the U.S. established reconcentration zones. Civilians were forcibly relocated into guarded camps. Conditions were deadly. These were widely recognized by historians as concentration camps. Japanese-American incarceration, 1942 to 1945. Over 100,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly removed from their homes held in remote camps surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. No charges, no trials, no due process. These were concentration camps, even though the U.S. government used euphemisms like relocation centers. Cold War detention systems. The U.S. built emergency plans for mass detention of subversives. Some facilities were prepared, but never activated. Shows the infrastructure and mindset remained. Post 9/11 detention. Guantanamo Bay functions as extrajudicial detention, indefinite confinement, outside normal legal protections. It fits the definition of a concentration camp, though not an extermination camp. ICE and CBP detentions of the 2000s to present. Mass detention of migrants and asylum seekers, overcrowding, deprivation, lack of due process. Children separated from families. People held for months or years without trial. These facilities are part of a continuum of U.S. mass detention practices. So the pattern. Every time the U.S. has built a mass detention system, it has been justified by fear, racialization, national security rhetoric, claims of public order, bureaucratic necessity. This mirrors global patterns of how concentration camps emerge. So I just mentioned Andersonville when we were talking about the camps during the Civil War. So let me dig into that for just a moment. Andersonville Camp Sumter. What made it so infamous? So here's some basic facts. Andersonville was a Confederate prisoner of war camp in Georgia during the U.S. Civil War. Operated for only 14 months, 1864 to 1865. Held about 45,000 Union soldiers. Around 13,000 died, the mortality rate of nearly 30%. Why conditions were catastrophic? Severe overcrowding, designed for 10,000, held more than 30,000 at its peak. No proper shelter. Most prisoners lived in makeshift tents or holes dug into the ground. A single polluted stream served as drinking water, bathing water, and sewage. Minimal food, often spoiled or nutritionally inadequate. Almost no medical care. Why it matters in this conversation. Andersonville shows how quickly a camp becomes lethal when overcrowding, deprivation, lack of sanitation, lack of medical care, and bureaucratic neglect combine. It also demonstrates that mass death can occur without explicit extermination policies. The cost of running camps, that was my thought, they have to be expensive. So concentration versus extermination. So concentration camps require guards, food, even if it's inadequate, transportation, record keeping, fencing, barracks, or holding structures, sanitation, often minimal. They are expensive, even when run poorly. States often justify them as temporary, necessary for security, cost saving. In reality, they drain resources and require a large bureaucratic network. Extermination camps require transportation networks, so rail lines, trucks, secrecy infrastructure, specialized killing facilities, crematoria or mass graves, chemical supplies, in the Nazi case, and trained personnel. They are logistically complex and require planning, coordination, industrial support, and political cover. Extermination is not cheaper, it's industrialized killing. So the network behind both systems. Camps rely on police, military, bureaucrats, transportation workers, medical staff, or the absence of them, supply chains, and administrators. Camps are never the work of a few bad actors. They are systems, not isolated facilities. Let's talk about disease for a moment. It's a feature, it's not a bug. Why disease spreads? Overcrowding, malnutrition, contaminated water, lack of sanitation, no medical care, stress weakened immune systems. Common diseases in camps: dysentery, typhus, cholera, tuberculosis, influenza, measles, and pneumonia. The hidden benefit to oppressors: death by disease is deniable, it's cheap, it's politically convenient, and it's easy to blame on the victims. It allows authorities to say, we didn't kill them, the disease did. Conditions are unfortunate, but not intentional. In reality, neglect is a form of violence. Allowing disease to spread is a way to reduce population, break morale, and avoid accountability. Historical examples include Andersonville, British camps in South Africa, Spanish camps in Cuba, Nazi camps, especially in the early years, Soviet Gulag, and Japanese American camps, lower mortality, but disease was still present. So the social dynamics inside of camps. Comradeship. Prisoners often form tight bonds, mutual aid networks, shared rituals, protective groups. These relationships preserve humanity, reduce psychological collapse, and increase survival. There's also the every man for himself dynamics. Extreme deprivation can produce hoarding, theft, betrayal, and competition for scarce resources. This is not a moral failing. It's a survival response. Why both dynamics coexist. Camps create solidarity, desperation, trauma, moral injury. Humans oscillate between cooperation and self-preservation. The environment shapes behavior, not character. So an anthropological insight. In every camp system studied, mutual aid increases survival rates. But no one survives on cooperation alone. The system is designed to break people. Early warning signals of a camp system emerging. So 1, there's bureaucratic language, processing centers, holding facilities, temporary relocation, security zones. Euphemisms hide intent. 2, targeting a specific group, framed as dangerous, criminal, diseased, disloyal, not like us. 3, suspension of due process, detention without trial, fast-track deportations, secret lists, administrative detention. 4, overcrowded facilities. Temporary, quote-unquote, temporary sites become permanent. Numbers exceed capacity and conditions deteriorate. 5, militarization, armed guards, barbed wire, restricted movement, surveillance. 6, normalization. Public becomes accustomed to images of cages, mass detention, and children separated from families. Outrage fades. 7, expansion. Camps grow in number, size, and purpose. New groups get added. Now let's talk about the psychology of public acceptance. So we have fear. Leaders frame the targeted group as dangerous, criminal, diseased, or invaders. Fear overrides empathy. Next comes scapegoating. Social problems are blamed on a vulnerable group. Camps become a solution. Then there's othering. The group is portrayed as less human, less deserving, outside the moral circle. This reduces public resistance. Bureaucratic distance. People don't see the suffering directly. Harm becomes abstract. It's not my job becomes a shield. Historical examples. Japanese American incarceration, Soviet Gulag, Nazi camps in the early years, British camps in South Africa, Spanish camps in Cuba, U.S. detention of migrants, Chinese detention of, I don't know that word, Uyghurs. And then there's Myanmar's Rohingya camps. My apologies. And then there's the final psychological shift. Camps become normal, expected, and invisible. Once normalized, they are extremely difficult to dismantle. Have you ever wondered, do any U.S. laws allow or prevent the building of new camps? I'll let you know what I found. So the short answer is there are no U.S. laws, federal, state, or city, that explicitly authorize the creation of concentration camps or extermination camps. There are also no explicit prohibitions on building new detention camps as a category because the U.S. law does not use the term concentration camps. Instead, the legal landscape is built around immigration detention, criminal detention, emergency powers, zoning and land use law, and constitutional protections. This creates a gray zone where mass detention systems can emerge without ever being called camps. Federal law, what does exist? Immigration Detention Authority. Federal law allows, and again, I'm not an attorney, this is just what I found. Federal law allows the government to detain undocumented immigrants, asylum seekers, and people awaiting immigration hearings. These facilities can be federally run, privately run, or run through local contracts. This is the legal basis for ICE and CBP detention centers. Emergency powers. The federal government has broad emergency powers to detain groups, restrict movement, create temporary facilities. Historically used for Japanese American incarceration, World War II, Cold War emergency detention planning. So what no longer exists? The McCarran Internal Security Act of 1950 once authorized emergency detention camps. Its detention provisions were repealed in 1971. So there's no current federal statute explicitly authorizing camps. State and local law. What exists? No state explicitly authorizes camps. No state has a law saying you may build a concentration camp. You may build an extermination camp. No state explicitly bans them. States regulate prisons, jails, juvenile facilities, mental health institutions, but there is no category in law called concentration camps, so nothing bans them by name. What does exist? Zoning laws, environmental regulations, building codes, licensing requirements, anti-discrimination laws, state constitutional protections. These can be used to block or slow the creation of new detention facilities, but they do not ban them outright. Could a state or municipality block a new camp? The short answer is yes, but only if the facility is not federally controlled. No, if the federal government chooses to build or operate it directly. This is because of federal supremacy. When a state can block a facility, a state, county, or city can block a detention facility if it is privately run. So states can refuse business licenses, zoning approval, construction permits, environmental permits. This is how some states have blocked private prisons. It is locally run. Local governments can refuse contracts with ICE, use of county jails for immigration detention, cooperation agreements. Several cities and counties have already done this. It violates state constitutional rights. States can argue unlawful detention, due process violations, civil rights violations. State courts can block facilities on these grounds. When a state cannot block a facility. If the federal government builds on federal land, states have no authority over military bases, federal buildings, federal land. A federal detention center on federal land cannot be blocked by state law. If the federal government invokes emergency powers, in a declared emergency, federal authority expands. States cannot override federal emergency detention orders. If the facility is run by a federal agency, so ICE, CBP, DHS, Bureau of Prisons, states cannot regulate federal agencies. What it would take to block camps nationwide. 1. Federal legislation. Congress could pass a law banning mass detention without due process, restricting immigration detention, prohibiting private detention facilities. This is the only way to create national prohibition. 2. State constitutional amendments. States could add bans on private detention, bans on mass detention, strict due process protections. These would apply only to state-run facilities. 3. Local ordinances. Cities, counties can ban contracts with ICE, ban private detention centers, restrict zoning for detention facilities. These are effective but limited. The uncomfortable truth. The U.S. legal system does not have built-in safeguards that automatically prevent the creation of new concentration camps. The only real barriers are political resistance, public pressure, state-local refusal to cooperate, and constitutional litigation. This is why understanding the history and the warning signs matters so much. So my next question was, can extermination camps be established in the U.S. today? And the short answer is no. Extermination camps like those built in World War II Europe cannot legally be established in the United States as the country exists today. There are multiple layers of law, oversight, and structural constraints that makes a state-run, industrialized killing system, the kind like the Nazis built, impossible under current U.S. legal frameworks. That said, it's important to understand why they cannot be established, because the reasons illuminate the difference between extermination camps and other forms of mass detention, which can exist. So why extermination camps cannot be established? So 1, constitutional protections. The U.S. Constitution prohibits extrajudicial killing, deprivation of life without due process, cruel and unusual punishment. These protections apply to citizens and non-citizens on U.S. soil. 2, federal and state criminal law. Murder is illegal under every jurisdiction. Conspiracy to commit murder is illegal. A state-run killing facility would violate homicide statutes, civil rights statutes, federal criminal codes. 3, international law. The U.S. is bound by the Geneva Conventions, the Genocide Convention, the Convention Against Torture, customary international humanitarian law. A state-run extermination system would violate all of these. 4, oversight and transparency. Modern surveillance, independent media, whistleblower protections, international monitoring, civil rights organization, congressional oversight. These make secret, industrialized killing nearly impossible. 5. Bureaucratic and logistical barriers. Extermination camps require secrecy, industrial infrastructure, coordinated killing systems, disposal systems. These cannot be built without procurement trails, environmental permits, contractor involvement, and paper trails, all of which would be visible. What can be established under current law, and this is the uncomfortable part. 1. Mass detention systems, immigration detention, emergency detention, federal holding facilities, processing centers, tent cities, rapid-built detention infrastructure. These are all legal under immigration law, emergency powers, and federal supremacy. 2. Facilities with lethal conditions. Even though extermination camps cannot be built, camps where people die due to neglect can exist and historically have existed. Deaths from disease, dehydration, exposure, lack of medical care, and overcrowding are not legally classified as extermination, even though they may be predictable or preventable. This is why historians distinguish between extermination camps, which are designed to kill, and lethal concentration camps, which have conditions that cause death. The latter are legally possible, the former are not. So the historical pattern. In every society that has built extermination camps, the sequence is 1. Mass detention, 2. Dehumanization, 3. Normalization of suffering, 4. Expansion of state power, 5. Legal erosion, and 6. Industrialized killing. The U.S. is structurally capable of step 1 and 3 because those involve detention and neglect. It is not structurally capable of step 6 under current law. So the bottom line. Extermination camps, industrialized killing centers, cannot be legally or structurally established in the U.S. today. Concentration camps, so mass detention systems with harmful or lethal conditions, can exist and have existed. The distinction matters because it helps us recognize what is legally impossible, what is legally possible, and what historical patterns we should be alert to. Let's talk about how democracies slide towards atrocity and what stops the slide. So, the pattern always begins with detention, not with killing. No society in history has ever jumped straight to extermination. The sequence is always identify a group, isolate them, detain them, normalize their suffering, expand state power, and then escalate harm. The early stages look legal, administrative, or temporary. Democracies are not immune. They are often the first to build camps. Britain in the Boer War, Spain in Cuba, United States, Philippines, Japanese-American incarceration, France, Algeria, Australia, offshore detention. Democracies tend to use euphemisms, frame camps as humanitarian, rely on bureaucracy rather than overt violence. What accelerates the slide? Fear. So war, terrorism, economic collapse, disease outbreaks. Fear makes the public accept extraordinary measures. Dehumanization. The targeted group is framed as criminals, invaders, parasites, subhuman. Once a group is outside the moral circle, harm becomes easier to justify. Legal erosion. Emergency powers. Suspension of due process. Administrative detention. Temporary measures that become permanent. Democracies often erode rights slowly, through paperwork. Bureaucratic diffusion. No single person feels responsible. Harm becomes procedural, routine. Just my job. This is how ordinary people become part of extraordinary cruelty. Expansion of the camp system. More facilities, more detainees, longer detention, broader categories of people targeted. Expansion is a major warning sign. What slows or stops the slide? Public visibility. When the public sees overcrowding, children in cages, disease outbreaks, deaths in custody, outrage can slow expansion. Independent media. Investigative reporting, leaked photos, whistleblower testimony, documentation disrupts secrecy. Legal intervention. Courts can block policies, enforce due process, mandate minimum standards. Legal challenges often slow but rarely fully stop detention systems. Civil societies, religious groups, NGOs, human rights organizations. These groups monitor conditions, provide aid, raise alarms, mobilize public pressure. Political accountability. So, elections, legislative oversight, public hearings, these mechanisms can dismantle or restrict camp systems, but only when the political will exists. The historical truth. Democracies rarely build extermination camps. Democracies often build concentration camps. Democracies sometimes allow those camps to become lethal, abusive, indefinite, and normalized. The danger is not that a democracy will suddenly build an extermination camp. The danger is that a democracy will build a detention system that becomes so normalized that the public stops seeing the harm. How ICE and CBP facilities fit the historical pattern. So, structural similarities to historical camp systems. Mass detention. Large numbers of people held in confined spaces for administrative, not criminal reasons. Targeted group. Overwhelmingly migrants and asylum seekers from specific regions and racialized groups. Suspended rights. People held without meaningful access to counsel, full hearings, or timely review. Euphemistic language. Processing centers. Holding facilities. Family residential centers, soft-sided facilities. Conditions that echo historical concentration camps. Overcrowding. People sleeping on floors, in shifts, or in standing room-only cells. Deprivation. Limited access to hygiene, inadequate food, lack of bedding, exposure to cold or heat. Medical neglect. Delayed or denied care. Preventable illnesses. Deaths in custody. Indefinite timelines. People not knowing how long they will be held, or what will happen next. Key differences from extermination camps. No industrialized killing apparatus, no gas chambers, crematoria, or explicit death through design. Stated purpose, administrative processing, deterrence, and border control, not explicit extermination. Legal framing, grounded in immigration and border law, not explicit annihilation policies. Why historians still use the concentration camp frame. The core elements are present. Concentration of a targeted group, outside normal legal protections, under state control. Harm arises from conditions and neglect, not from formalized killing program, yet the suffering is real, predictable, and systemic. Abuse inside camps, so power, vulnerability, and harm. Why abuse is structurally baked in. Extreme power imbalance. Guards and staff control food, movement, information, and safety. Isolation. Detainees are cut off from family, lawyers, and outside witnesses. Dehumanization. People are treated as numbers, cases, or illegals, not as full humans. Impunity. Complaints are hard to file, easy to ignore, and rarely lead to consequences. Types of abuse commonly documented. Physical abuse. Beatings, excessive force, use of restraints, punitive isolation. Psychological abuse. Threats, humiliation, sleep deprivation, deliberate uncertainty, racial slurs. Sexual abuse by staff, coercion, assault, harassment, trading favors for safety or basic needs. Sexual abuse by other detainees, assaults in overcrowded, unsupervised, or poorly supervised spaces. Neglect as abuse, denial of medical care, ignoring injuries, withholding hygiene products. U.S. context, so ICE, CBP, and related detention. Documented patterns, reports of sexual assault and harassment by guards, abuse of children and teens in custody, use of solitary or isolation-like conditions, retaliation against those who complain or speak to media and lawyers. Underreporting, fear of deportation or retaliation, language barriers, lack of legal representation, disbelief or dismissal of complaints. Global context. Similar patterns appear in refugee camps, wartime detention centers, political prisons, re-education or internment facilities. Across contexts, the same ingredients predict abuse. Overcrowding, lack of oversight, dehumanizing rhetoric, impunity for staff. Why numbers are hard to pin down. Underreporting, many survivors never file complaints. Suppression, states and institutions often minimize or bury reports. Methodological limits, different systems track abuse differently, if at all. The safest, most honest statement is abuse in detention is widespread, systemic, and consistently underestimated. Human dynamics inside abusive systems. Some staff become perpetrators, some staff become bystanders, numbed or afraid to intervene. Some staff quietly resist, smuggling information, softening harm, or whistleblowing. Detainees navigate solidarity and mutual protection, fear and self-preservation, trauma, shame, and survival strategies. So now let's talk about how survivors carry this forward: trauma, testimony, and memory. Individual trauma, psychological wounds, PTSD, depression, anxiety, disassociation, survivor's guilt. Body memory, sleep problems, chronic pain, startle responses, health issues linked to prolonged stress. Identity disruption, shame, loss of trust in institutions, difficulty feeling safe anywhere. Family and community impact, silence versus storytelling. Some never speak of it, others build their lives around telling the story. Intergenerational trauma, children and grandchildren inherit fear, hypervigilance, and mistrust of the state. Fragmented communities, displacement, loss of elders, loss of cultural continuity. Testimony as resistance, bearing witness. Survivor stories challenge denial and minimization. Creating records, memoirs, interviews, court testimony, truth commissions. Reclaiming dignity, telling the story on one's own terms is a way to reassert humanity. Memory and forgetting, official forgetting. States often downplay, rename, or erase camp histories. Counter-memory, museums, memorials, archives, survivor groups keep the truth alive. Moral function, memory is not just about the past, it's a warning system for the present. What real accountability and prevention would look like. So legal accountability, clear prohibitions, laws that tightly limit mass detention and ban private detention for profit. Enforceable standards, binding requirements for space, sanitation, medical care, and time limits. Consequences, criminal liability for severe neglect, abuse, and deaths in custody, not just policy reviews. Structural safeguards, independent oversight, unannounced inspections by bodies not controlled by the detaining agency. Transparency, public reporting of deaths, illnesses, complaints, and use of force. Access, guaranteed entry for lawyers, journalists, NGOs, and family members. Cultural and political safeguards. Rejecting dehumanizing language, refusing labels that turn people into problems instead of persons. Protecting dissent, safeguarding whistleblowers, journalists, and advocates who expose abuse. Political cost, making it clear that expanding camps carries electoral and reputational consequences. Centering survivors, listening first. Policy shaped by those who have lived through detention, not just by officials. Reparative measures, apologies, compensation, legal status where relevant, and support for healing. Memorialization, honest public acknowledgement, sites, curricula, and rituals that say, this happened and it was wrong. The core principle, a democracy serious about prevention doesn't just say, never again. It builds systems where mass detention is rare and tightly constrained, abuse is visible and punishable, and the people most harmed are the ones shaping what comes next. What happens to children when their parents are detained? So U.S.-born child, parents detained. That was one scenario I looked at. If another legal guardian exists, the child may stay with a non-detained parent, relative, or approved guardian. If no guardian is available or reachable quickly, child can be taken into custody by the state child welfare, so like foster care. Parent may lose practical ability to participate in decisions about the child. Risk, long separations, difficulty reunifying, even termination of parental rights in extreme cases. So what about a foreign-born child and the parents are detained? If detained together, they may be held in what is called family facilities, often still carceral and harmful. If separated, so different processing, age, or policy, child may be placed in something called ORR, so the Office of Refugee Resettlement, custody, or shelter. Child can be moved far from the parent, even across states. In both cases, communication is difficult, slow, and often inconsistent. If a child is born to a woman in custody, that's another scenario I looked at, birth in custody. So the location, usually at a local hospital, under guard. Immediately after birth, mother may be returned to detention quickly. Infant may or may not be allowed to remain with her, depending on facility type and policy. What happens to the baby? If the mother is in a family facility, the baby may stay with her in detention. If not, baby may be released to family in the U.S. if available and approved, or placed in foster or the ORR that I mentioned, custody, if no suitable guardian is identified. Legal status. If the child is born on U.S. soil, the child is a U.S. citizen, regardless of mother's status. This does not automatically protect the mother from detention or removal. Let's talk about Native American individuals detained, despite being neither foreign-born nor foreign. So why this happens. Border regions where tribal lands predate the U.S.-Mexico border. Members of tribes whose territory spans the border. Misidentification, racial profiling, or lack of recognition of tribal IDs. What it reveals. Sovereignty conflicts. Tribal nations versus federal border enforcement. Racialization. Indigenous people treated as foreign on their own ancestral lands. Continuity. Echoes of earlier U.S. practices of confining and controlling Native peoples. When members of Congress visit facilities, what can actually change? So what can they do immediately? Document conditions. Photos were allowed, notes, testimonies from detainees and staff. Apply pressure, public statements, hearings, letters to agencies, media attention. Demand fixes, more space, better sanitation, medical staff, access to lawyers, and phones. What can they do structurally? Legislation. Set binding standards for conditions, cap detention lengths, expand alternatives to detention. Funding leverage. Restrict or condition funding for agencies and private contractors. Defund specific facilities or practices. Limits. Individual visits can improve conditions at specific sites, especially in the short term. Without law plus funding changes, the overall system tends to revert to harmful baselines. So I got into AI and I asked a hypothetical. What if a new president came in at the next presidential election with the intent of quote unquote restoring order, right? So assuming a president who wants to reduce harm and align with human rights. That was the goal. So 1, immediate executive actions and specific abusive practices. Halt family separation, restrict solitary segregation use, mandate minimum standards for space, hygiene, and medical care. Shift enforcement priorities. Focus on serious crimes, not broad immigration sweeps. 2, policy and regulatory changes. Expand alternatives to detention. Community-based programs, case management instead of cages. Tighten detention criteria. Detention is a last resort, not a default. Increase transparency. Mandatory public reporting on deaths, illnesses, and complaints. 3, working with Congress. Seek legislation to cap detention durations, ban or phase out private immigration detention, fund legal representation for vulnerable groups, like children. 4, cultural and institutional shifts. Directive language. Explicitly reject dehumanizing rhetoric in official communications. Training and accountability. Human rights training for staff. Real consequences for abuse and neglect. 5, the realistic bottom line. A single president can dramatically reduce the scale and cruelty of detention, close specific facilities, and change enforcement priorities. To truly transform the system, they would need congressional cooperation, sustained public pressure, and durable legal changes that outlast one administration. Let's talk about strengthening the guardrails, what a future president could do to prevent recurrence. These are structural, legal, and cultural guardrails, the kinds that outlast a single administration. For the executive branch guardrails, codify strict detention standards through regulation, minimum space per person, mandatory medical staffing, limits on child detention, temperature, sanitation, nutrition requirements, public reporting on deaths, illnesses, complaints. End or restrict private detention contracts, phase out private immigration detention, require federal operation with full oversight, mandate transparency for any remaining contracts. Create an independent oversight body, not housed within DHS, authority to conduct unannounced inspections, power to issue binding corrective orders. Expand alternatives to detention, case management programs, community-based supervision, legal orientation programs. These have high compliance rates and reduce the need for camps. Legislative guardrails, so this requires Congress, statutory limits on detention length, hard caps such as 30 days, unless a judge approves extension, special protections for children and families, ban family separation except in true safety emergencies, codify that separation cannot be used as deterrence, guarantee legal representation for vulnerable groups, children, people with disabilities, survivors of trafficking or torture. Create a statutory floor for conditions, binding standards that cannot be waived by executive action. strengthen whistleblower protections, shield staff who report abuse, protect contractors who expose violations. So then there's cultural and institutional guardrails. And dehumanizing language in official communications. Language shapes public tolerance for cruelty. Mandatory human rights training for all detention staff, trauma-informed care, cultural competency, anti-bias training. Public transparency as a norm, regular facility tours, public dashboards, annual reports to Congress. These guardrails make it harder for future administrations to quietly expand or worsen detention systems. Children in deportation. What happens when a parent is removed? If a child is born in U.S. custody and the mother is deported, so let's look at that situation first. If the child is a U.S. citizen, so born on U.S. soil, the mother can request to take the child with her. The U.S. government generally allows this if the mother has legal custody, there is no other legal guardian in the U.S., and no safety concerns exist. If the child remains in the U.S., this happens when another parent or guardian is present. The mother requests the child to stay. Child welfare intervenes. The mother may lose practical ability to reunify later. If a woman is deported and has other children in the United States, she can request to take them with her. If she has sole legal custody, she can elect to take her children. If the children are U.S. citizens, they retain citizenship even if they leave. She cannot take them if another parent has custody, there is a custody dispute, the child is in foster care, the child welfare system blocks removal, the child is old enough to express a preference. This varies by state. The painful reality. Many deported parents are separated from their children because they cannot locate them, they cannot navigate the system from abroad. Paperwork and bureaucracy create barriers. State child welfare systems sometimes move toward termination of parental rights. This is one of the most devastating consequences of mass detention and deportation. Who profits from detention systems? Private prison corporations, companies that run detention centers under a federal contract. Profit increases with more detainees, longer detention, fewer services. Incentive structure, maximize occupancy, minimize care. Security and surveillance contractors, companies providing cameras, biometric systems, tracking software, perimeter fencing. These contracts can be worth millions and often expand quietly. Transportation and logistics, bus companies, air charter companies, fuel suppliers, food service vendors. Every transfer, every meal, every supply run is billable. Construction and maintenance, firms that build fences, barracks, temporary structures, soft-sided facilities. Emergency contracts often bypass normal bidding processes. Tech companies, data storage, case management software, facial recognition, predictive analytics. These systems become embedded in the bureaucracy and hard to dismantle. Local economies. Rural communities sometimes depend on detention centers for jobs, federal dollars, infrastructure investment. This creates political pressure to keep the beds full. Moving on to bureaucracy, lists, and administrative machinery of harm. I recently saw a series of reels on social media. The man was a Serbian survivor of genocide. And if you haven't seen him, I don't really know how to search for these things on social media, but he gives a very real, very honest representation of what happened. So I was thinking of him when I moved through this next section. Genocide and mass detention are not spontaneous. They are administrative projects. So lists are always created long before the violence begins. Census data, residency records, school enrollment lists, voter rolls, immigration databases, social service records. These are not inherently harmful, but they can be weaponized. Why lists matter? They allow rapid identification, targeted raids, efficient roundups, tracking of families, mapping of communities. The illusion of neutrality. Bureaucratic data feels harmless, routine, just paperwork, but bureaucracy is the backbone of every modern atrocity. Historical echoes. Nazi Germany used census and religious affiliation data. Rwanda used national ID cards. Bosnia used residency and ethnic identity records. China uses digital surveillance and biometric databases. The lesson. The danger is not the data itself. The danger is who controls it, how it is used, and what legal constraints exist. The administrative logic of atrocity. Atrocities are logistical projects, transport schedules, supply chains, staffing rosters, procurement orders, record keeping. Violence becomes efficient when it becomes bureaucratic. Ordinary people become part of the machine. Clerks, drivers, guards, procurement officers, IT staff, maintenance workers, most are not ideologues. They are functionaries. The moral danger. When harm is broken into small tasks, no one feels responsible for the whole. Why people don't recognize the lists being built. The tasks look normal. Update the database. Verify addresses. Collect demographic information. Improve efficiency. The public assumes good faith. It's just for planning. It's for resource allocation. It's for safety. The shift happens quietly. A new policy here, a new database there, a new requirement for ID, a new enforcement policy. By the time the purpose becomes clear, the infrastructure is already in place. So why does this belong in this conversation? Because I feel it's important to understand camps don't appear out of nowhere. They grow from ordinary systems. The danger is not dramatic, it's administrative. The warning signs are in the paperwork, not in the barbed wire. This is the connective tissue between history, anthropology, psychology, and the present moment. Let's now switch to the role of technology in modern detention systems. So technology expands the reach and efficiency of detention. Digital tools allow governments to track movement, identify individuals, predict risk, automate decisions. This creates a system that is faster, larger, and harder to oversee. Surveillance infrastructure. Facial recognition at borders and checkpoints, license plate readers, drone monitoring, cell phone tracking, biometric databases. So fingerprints, iris scans, DNA. Data systems, case management software, predictive analytics for flight risk, automated alerts for visa overstays, cross-agency data sharing. These systems can be opaque and difficult to challenge. Private tech companies as key players, cloud storage, AI-driven analytics, database management, cybersecurity. These companies often operate without public oversight, yet hold the infrastructure that makes mass detention scalable. The danger. Technology can make detention more efficient, more automated, more invisible. The more automated the system, the easier it is for harm to become routine. The border is a psychological and political symbol. Borders are not just lines, they are narratives. Borders symbolize safety, identity, belonging, threat. Politicians use borders to invoke fear and unity, depending on the moment. Why borders become sites of moral panic? They represent the edge of us and them. They are easy to frame as under attack, overwhelmed, vulnerable. Fear at the border becomes fear of the other. How borders justify extraordinary measures, emergency powers, rapid construction of facilities, suspension of due process, militarization. Borders become places where the public tolerates actions they would reject elsewhere. The border is a political stage. Leaders use border imagery to demonstrate strength, signal control, rally supporters, distract from domestic issues. This makes border policy emotionally charged and politically useful. The result: the border becomes a place where rights are thinned, oversight is weak, suffering is normalized. This is why detention systems often grow fastest at borders. Let's look now at the experience of guards and staff. Who becomes a guard? Often it's local residents seeking stable employment, people with limited job options, former military or law enforcement. Most are not ideologues, they are workers inside a system. Moral injury. Guards may experience guilt, shame, emotional numbing, conflict between orders and conscience. Many cope by distancing themselves from detainees. How ordinary people become part of harmful systems. Tasks are broken into small neutral steps. Harm becomes procedural, bureaucratic, just following policy. This is how systems perpetrate themselves without overt cruelty from every individual. Internal resistance. Some staff report abuse, leak information, advocate for detainees, quit and protest. Whistleblowers are often punished or ignored, but they are crucial to exposing harm. Why staff experiences matter. Understanding staff psychology helps explain how systems persist, why abuse can become normalized, where intervention points exist. It also humanizes the complexity without excusing the harm. Let's summarize everything. Concentration camps are not relics of the past. They are a modern tool of state power, built through bureaucracy, justified through fear, and sustained through dehumanization. They appear in democracies and dictatorships alike, and they grow quietly through paperwork, policy shifts, and the normalization of suffering. In the United States, we have seen versions of this before: indigenous removal, wartime incarceration, Cold War emergency plans, and now the mass detention of migrants and asylum seekers. These systems do not emerge suddenly. They grow from ordinary institutions, census data, surveillance tools, border rhetoric, and the economic incentives of private industry. Inside these facilities, people endure overcrowding, disease, neglect, and abuse. Children are separated from parents. Babies are born in custody. Families are torn apart. And the staff who work inside these systems face their own moral injuries, caught between orders and conscience. But history also shows that these systems can be challenged. Oversight, transparency, legal limits, and public pressure can slow or stop the slide. A future administration could strengthen guardrails and harmful practices and build a system rooted in dignity rather than fear. The lesson is simple and urgent. Camps do not begin with barbed wire. They begin with indifference. And the only way to prevent them from growing is to see them clearly, name them honestly, and refuse to accept the suffering of others as the price of our security. And that's where I'm going to end this talk today. The next one in this series will be the Nuremberg trials, and then the third in this series will be how societies remember atrocity. So I hope you will tune in for both of those. Please like, subscribe, share, comment. If you have suggestions for future talks, I am open to those. I have received some. They are on my list. I'm just trying to juggle everything that I have ideas for and also have been suggested to me. But I am in the process of more talks, I promise you. As always, I thank you for being here. I appreciate your presence, and I'll see you next time.